Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is G.I. Sanders from NTX Vinyl. It's good to be back with another video here on our Talking About Records series. I'm going to tell a little story, or I'm going to retell a little story. So I ran into a kind of an acquaintance, I guess you could say, a friend of a friend, someone that I don't know really well, just kind of know in passing. Ran into him the other day, and inevitably, amongst the small talk, work came up, and he asked me what I did, and I told him I owned an online record shop. And he said, records? Like, records? I said, yeah, believe it or not, a record shop. And he was very, very curious, which is a pretty common thing because a little unique these days to own a record shop. There's not that many of us that exist in this hobby, much less on the business side of it. So my first question for him was, well, how much time do you have? We did have some time to kill. And so I kind of told him the whole story because he was very curious, not only specifically about NTX Vinyl and my business, but just how the whole thing has come back. Now, for a lot of us, myself included, it never went away. If you've been collecting records for a long time and you've been kind of dedicated to it and it's a passion of yours, it never really went away. But for the vast majority of the general public, records absolutely went away, and now they are to some extent back again, right? The reality is the heyday of the vinyl record was back, the 60s through the 80s, let's say. Of course, they existed way before that. The first vinyl record was made back in the 30s, I think, or record, I should say, because those were probably shellac versus vinyl. But when most people think about vinyl, they think about records, they think about the 60s. Through the 80s, again, because it was the predominant physical format. Rock and roll was invented, the early 60s. You go through, the late 60s where music culturally was extremely important. Through the 70s and 80s. Now, I was born in 78, so my first real memory from a music standpoint is kind of the mid 80s. I would say probably 1985 or so was my introduction to a record. But around that same time, cassettes were really big, cassette tapes. And so I remember having 45 records, 7-inch singles as a kid when I was, school age. But I also remember cassettes as well. So as you got towards the late 80s, cassettes started to take over. And then, of course, CDs came along. And CDs were really the nail in the coffin for vinyl LPs as you got into the late 80s and early 90s, right? Now, records were still being made, of course, but the quantity from a production standpoint, from a manufacturing standpoint, drastically decreased in the early to mid 90s. Obviously, not everyone, but most people started getting rid of their record collections, or at the very least put them in a box in a closet, because CDs were the new thing and you could take them. They were portable. You put them in your car, you get a boom box, you get a 5-disc changer. The era of the CD absolutely put a nail in the coffin of records from a mainstream standpoint. Now, the most important thing about that in the story, as I was telling him, I was like, keep in mind, when CDs came along, not only did it change consumer behavior, but it changed the whole industry, because the pressing plants that for several decades were extremely successful and prominent and plentiful around the US and around the world just started to disappear. Absolutely started to disappear. So these huge manufacturing facilities that were pumping out thousands and thousands of vinyl LPs every day, they started to go away because there was no more market for records, because everyone had adapted to the CD. Again, not everyone, but most people. And so that's a very, very important part, right? So by mid 90s, pressing plants are going out of business. They're either evolving and transforming into CD duplication plants, or they're just completely going away. People are getting out of the business. By 2000, that's really what is considered to be kind of the end of the initial era, because by 2000, really mid 90s up to 2000, like there's no records coming out on a large scale. In fact, I was in a band in 2003, and our CD came out on a major label, came out on MCA Records, and I remember at that time, 2000, actually this was probably 2002 because it was before it came out. And I remember talking to our A&R rep at the label in 2002 because I was still a record nerd. I always have been. And I asked him, I was like, hey, are we going to get to release this on vinyl? And he looked at me like I was freaking crazy. And I remember him telling me, I remember where we were. It was before a gig in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And he happened to fly into that show to see us, and I had asked him that, and he told me that the top 1% of artists on the label at that time in 2002 had the option of maybe pressing some of their records to vinyl versus CD. The top 1%. Now, we were a brand new band, a little tiny baby band that had just got signed and putting out our record, so we were happy enough to have it being put on CD, but I thought that was very interesting. Now looking back, it was like there was basically no chance in hell unless we wanted to front the bill ourselves, right? And so again, I'm kind of telling my buddy about this story, and he's asking me questions along the way, and he's like, "Well, how did it come back if all of the pressing plants went away? For the most part, the vast majority of all the pressing plants went away. How then does this continue to stay afloat in any way? And how does now it come back from a mainstream perspective?" And, for him, he's like, yeah, I do. Now that I think about it, I have seen records in like Target and things like that. I didn't really think much about it. But so I told him, I was like, well, independent labels really kept it alive a lot. Their, independent labels have never, or a lot of them have never closed the doors on vinyl production. They're still doing 7-inch singles. They're still doing record clubs, still putting out some stuff on LP. So you can find records that were produced in 2000, 2005, 2010. They're just very, very scarce. You just don't see them that much, and hence why a lot of those original pressings from that era are very valuable, especially if they haven't ever been repressed recently, because there weren't many of them made. There weren't people looking for them, asking for them. Record shops didn't have them. Most of it was mail order, especially from those independent labels. Because again, when the pressing plants go away and the labels and distributors completely double down on CDs, the whole infrastructure of the industry was gone. It wasn't as simple as just like, oh, well, they're not making them anymore. It's like the A to Z from the artist to the pressing plant to the to the label to the distribution to the store. That whole thing was gone from vinyl's perspective, right? From this perspective of vinyl LPs. And so about, I don't know, 2010 or so. Well, let me back up a little bit. Early 2000s. That's when digital music comes along, right? So you got the evolution of Napster, file sharing, and then you get into eventually the iPod, which was huge, and other digital music players from all the other big companies. But Apple was the one who perfected it with the iPod around 2003, 2004. And then, of course, you had the iTunes store where downloads become available, and then you get into a streaming world, right? But so all of that had a huge impact on why vinyl gone away, and eventually why CDs had gone away. And so as I'm telling him, as he's asking me not only how, but why has vinyl made a comeback in 2000, I'd say around 2015 really is when I've been buying records that entire time. I was still buying records, whether it be in a record store, digging, in a garage sale, at a thrift store, whatever it may be. I'm still picking up records. Not in huge quantities, but along the way. And I've ramped up over time. The older I've gotten, the more committed I've gotten to it, the more settled down I've gotten. And so around 2010, around 2015 or so, that's a point in time where, records are long gone, but now CDs are even gone. This is an important part. So when the CD kind of goes away and is no longer the preferred format for the masses, because at that point, digital and streaming have taken over everything from a mass consumption standpoint. And that means all physical media is gone. So once CDs go away, then it's like, okay, now we're all digital. It's all in the device in our pocket, whether that be an iPod, an iPhone, whether that's on a computer. the vast majority of consumers who are buying music now are all buying digital files, or they're simply renting digital files. Physical media, as we know it, is gone from a mainstream perspective. So that means that nostalgia starts to take place. And the idea that records are bigger, they're sexier, larger format, that starts to become enticing again, because you've got generations of people, not so much like me, but younger generations, who don't know any physical media. Maybe it was in the house a little bit, but by the time, younger kids got jobs and they get into college and they're starting to have their own money and they're actually spending money on things, digital music is all they knew, and to some extent all they still know. So one of the big factors I was telling him of why records are back, why vinyl LPs are now back again, is because there is a renewed interest in things that are physical, that you can actually own and touch and feel and put on a shelf and live with it over time, right? Because now everything is sucked into our phone. We don't have telephones anymore. We don't have maps anymore. We don't have cameras anymore. We don't have photo books anymore. All the physicality of things that, like, I grew up, and certainly, older generations grew up. I was born in '78, so I'm getting close to being 50 years old here in a few years. And if you're my age, like, all that stuff that we used to have in our homes, it's all gone now. And so that has created this environment to where owning something again is like really neat. There's like added value to that, just the fact that it's a real thing, that it's not an apparition, it's not just floating in space, right? So pair that with the idea that people my age now, whether you've been collecting all along with me, which is not most people, but there's definitely a renewed interest from a nostalgia perspective, because now people are like, oh, I remember this when I was a kid. Like, that's a real thing. And on some level, this goes across a lot of different hobbies, whether it be sports cards or old video games, like whatever, those types of nostalgic things you had when you were a kid, that now you've got money and you can actually buy those things, whether it be new versions of them or the old versions, whatever it may be, originals or reissues, whatever it may be. The idea of owning it again, there's a lot of importance placed on that these days for a lot of people, myself included. So if you pair the idea that everything went so far digital, that now it's swinging back the other direction for a lot of people, because it's cool to just own anything physical. And then you pair the nostalgia factor with it, of people going, man, I remember that when I was a kid, I used to own that. Or, man, I remember seeing that in my house when I was a kid. Like, there's so much value there mentally on those types of things. That's why this thing is back. You can talk about, is it better? Do records sound better? You're supporting the artists by buying it. Like, there's a lot of reasons that play into the vinyl industry existing today, but those are the big ones. The over-indexing on the digitization of everything was the big one, and then people like myself getting to a certain age and being nostalgic about what they had when they were kids. That's why I hear from a lot of people why they're collecting again, just because it brings back great memories. And let's be honest, when you pull it up on your phone, you hit shuffle on a playlist, or you go to a station on Pandora, or you're in your car and you let it none of that is sticky. It's all very passive listening. It's in the background. I do it too. It's fine. It has its time and place. But when I actually want to hear an album, when I want to spend time with it, because I actually value it, because it has memories, life memories tied to it, I love the idea of sitting down and actually putting a record on. And that experience is what I was telling him is the real root of why it's back. For real collectors, for people who are in this kind of for the long haul. Sure, there's people who are kind of inching in, maybe they've got a few records, they got a cheap little turntable, like, that's fine. That exists in every hobby, in every industry. There are always people who are dipping their toe in the water. But for the people who get it, for the people who are committed to it and don't mind spending their hard-earned money on it, that's because of that experience. And I equate it to I'm not a movie person. Like, we don't watch a lot of movies. We don't go to the movie theater all that often. But the idea, at least going back to, again, dating myself, going back to, the Blockbuster days when you used to rent a movie, something like that. It used to be a thing where it's like, hey, what do you want to do tonight? And you would say, like, I don't know, you want to watch a movie? Okay. And then you'd, you used to go to the video store, or maybe you'd see what was on TV. Now you just doom scroll through freaking Netflix or Hulu or whatever the hell, trying to find something to watch, right? But the idea of, hey, what do you want to do tonight? Let's watch a movie. That means like, hey, we're going to sit down for an hour and a half, 2 hours, and we're going to dedicate our attention to watching this and consuming that content, because we hope it's going to be something that we enjoy. It brings happiness. It brings a little escapism from the real world, because you're watching this movie, right? Like, that's why people watch movies. It's very entertaining. I think about records in the same way, but you never hear, or at least you don't often hear, hey, do you want to listen? What do you want to do tonight? I don't know. You want to listen to a record? Like, that doesn't exist anymore. That used to be a thing. People, not in my livelihood, because again, I was born in '78. So by the time I'm, not a kid anymore, that doesn't exist anymore. But I've talked with people about that. I was telling him this. I was like, what happened to the culture of, hey, let's sit down and listen to a record? Like, that was a real thing where you would sit down and you would look over the liner notes and discuss it maybe with someone if you're doing it together, and you're like paying attention into it for like that hour. Like, that should be a thing again. I don't know if it's a thing for that many people. I know it is in my house. Like, literally, we'll be like, hey, what do you want to do? I don't know. You want to just go listen to some records? Like, that's really freaking cool. And that's what I love about this. But you've got to want that. You've got to be proactive with that. And a lot of it just comes down to the appreciation of the music. I think the reality is not about the value of the records, not how many records I have. Like, the only reason I own all these records is because I freaking love music. Like, that's the root of it. If all of this went away and I was just stuck with only having it digitally, I would still enjoy the music. I wouldn't appreciate it as much. I wouldn't gravitate towards things on these shelves near as much if I had to search for them on my phone. Believe me, I come in this room and I've got several thousand records to choose from. I'm very, very fortunate in that way. I've committed to this, and I choose something off of this wall that I would have never chosen off my phone. And so I'm telling all this to this guy, and the look on his face, he was just like dumbfounded. Like, wow, you really have thousands of records, first of all, and you go and you like make a point to listen to them and consume them. He was shocked. He was literally, he had no idea that was a thing for anybody, even small niche. I don't care if you have 100 records or 1,000 records or whatever, but the idea of sitting down and paying attention to music, that is something that is so far gone. This was just a normal dude, normal family man, my age. He had no idea that it even existed anymore. And that's sad. That's really sad, because that's how far we've come. That's how devalued music has become to the masses. Again, I'm not talking about you and me watching YouTube videos, making YouTube videos, and you watching YouTube videos, but to the general public, music is free. It is come and go. It is background. It is always there if you want it. So, there's no sense of urgency. That's where this gets so fun, because it scraps all of that and it demands your attention. It creates a connection between you and the physical item, and it's something you have to take care of and own, and it becomes a part of your life, hopefully forever. Hopefully, that's the idea. And so it was cool talking with this guy. I love talking with people who have a completely different context from me, because I'm so close to this stuff. I live it, I breathe it, as a lot of collectors do. So it was an interesting conversation, and I thought, man, this is one where I need to surface this to a broader audience to get your opinion. So again, you're probably a collector, or at least very passionate about music. So you may not have his blinders on that he had, but maybe you're not. Maybe you come across this video and you're like, yeah, I know exactly what that guy's talking about. I had no idea records are being made again. Let me know what you think. I'm always up for a good conversation in the comments. So appreciate you watching. As always, this has been another episode of Talking About Records. We will see you again next time.